Welcome to The Good Oil, the podcast bringing you the real science on omega-3 fatty acids. Today I'm joined by Dr. Ryan Anthony, a researcher from the Graduate School of Medicine at the University of Wollongong in Australia, who spent years studying what omega-3s actually do in people who train hard. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you very much. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, first time in The Good Oil.
It is, yes.
So before we get started, I just wanted to ask you, how does maybe give me a short version of how does someone end up dedicating their career or their research work in omega-3?
So it actually started, I was a nutrition science undergrad, and I remember hearing in one of my lectures something about omega-3s and how they get into cell membranes. And I thought, wow, that's something.
Yeah.
Fast forward, finish that, do a bit of research in an honours year with Greg Peoples at the University of Wollongong. And then following that, we basically had a project that just appeared. It was a master's level project in older adults with omega-3s. And I thought I'll give it a go and got hooked, then did a whole PhD on it and have never left.
Excellent. Well, let's set the scene in terms of why omega-3 status matters in trained adults. When we talk about DHA and EPA, what are they actually doing in the body that makes them, worth studying?
Yeah. I think what's important about them, and that differs from some other nutrients, is that they actually get incorporated into cell membranes. So they basically insert themselves into these phospholipids into virtually every cell in the body.
Mm.
From there, they help orchestrate what that cell does. So you can really influence quite a bit by inserting these molecules into those phospholipid membranes over time.
Oh, excellent. And then your research focuses specifically on physically trained, adults, people training, 5 or more days a week. Why is that particular group particularly interesting when it comes to omega-3 status?
I think specifically in that group, like I mentioned, those DHA molecules and EPA to an extent gets incorporated into all these cell membranes. So things like the heart, the brain, muscle, immune cells. And as an athlete, especially people training, even if you're just a gym junkie that goes to the gym, 3, 4 times a week, you put your whole system under such a great strain that all those systems have to be optimized to actually recover.
Yeah.
So you have the immune side of things, you have skeletal muscle recovery, you've got being able to reproduce force. Um, so where DHA really plays a role in that group that we think is basically inserting itself into all those different systems to help support the whole.
So in your research, you're using a tool, omega-3 index, as a way of measuring the amount of DHA, EPA in the subject's blood. Why is it more meaningful than simply asking someone what they ate last week?
So the omega-3 index, like you correctly said, is how much EPA and DHA is in the red blood cells specifically. Why that's important is we don't actually care what's happening in the red blood cell. It serves as a marker to tell us what's happening at all those other tissues, acknowledging that there's different rates at which those other tissues will go up or increase, but it gives us a good idea of, let's say, a muscle. If we want to know, is DHA actually making it to where we want it to go to? That red blood cell serves as a marker for us to be able to track that over time because those red blood cells turn over in about 120 days.
Mm.
So it's that long-term intake, a bit like the difference between, say, HbA1c for blood glucose versus just a finger prick instantaneous blood glucose test.
Yeah.
It gives us an indication of what's happening over time, and that correlates pretty well with most major organs in our body. So generally what we found is people can report things a little bit inaccurately. We have recall bias and memory. Can't remember what I had for breakfast. But having that marker as an objective measure to say we're reasonably confident, or as confident as we can be, that the blood's gone up, it's reasonably non-invasive, we can be pretty assured that the muscle's gone up as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. And what does that omega-3 index look like, in terms of when you measure your subjects? What are we aiming for
Yep.
in terms of a good result?
Very good point. So that index range is actually derived from cardiovascular research. We have adapted it slightly where you've got these ranges of below 4% is not great, 4 to 6% is kind of that intermediate risk, 6 to 8 slightly higher risk, and then 8% and above is where we want to be.
Mm.
Most Australians, and we've actually had an update to the world map, Australia sits at about 5.4%. So we're quite low in terms of where we would want to be for cardiovascular disease protection.
Mm.
And we see a very similar thing in athletes. The athletes aren't magical and they don't all of a sudden, because they're healthy and train, they just have a higher level. They're virtually the exact same.
So,
So
did you find that surprising that a well-trained athlete actually had a very low, between 4 and 5 omega-3 index?
yes and no. No, in that it's they're humans, so
Yeah,
they
yeah,
fit the general population. But yes, because I know how important omega-3s are, that I would think if you are a reasonably high level athlete, you're going to try and optimize everything. And it seems
yeah,
like
yeah,
very low hanging fruit to just take a fish oil supplement.
yeah, yeah. I just want to go. I want to move, direction a bit in terms of study design, which you had published a paper around a review criticizing how poorly designed a lot of the omega-3 research papers have been published. What are the common mistakes researchers make in this space? And we just talked about with Greg and Lee, is that you open up the newspaper and you see one day it's really great results, and some days it's omega-3 is the worst thing you could have. But
Yeah.
so I'm just keen to understand what are the key mistakes that researchers make.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's the negative findings that seem to get headline results. And actually, I think about a week ago, we had something similar with Alzheimer's disease.
Yes,
But where a lot of that comes undone, we've seen it in cardiovascular disease space, we've seen it in omega-3 and preterm births and Alzheimer's, is they're not actually measuring that the intervention group is actually taking what they're meant to be taking and the control group is not taking that. So unlike a drug where you give a beta blocker to the intervention group and no beta blocker to the control group,
yeah,
omega-3s are found in food. So we can't completely eliminate it.
yeah,
So we need to be able to measure some way to say these groups are separate enough that we can actually compare them and say that they are different. If you're not measuring a blood biomarker, it's really hard to do that through a dietary survey. So not separating those groups, you basically got a big mix of a quasi intervention group,
yeah,
and there's no difference between them.
yeah.
So
So you set out to do what previous studies had not done well, with some of your research work. Walk us through your study and what were the participants, what did they take and for how long?
yeah. I'll just go back to that study design point. One other thing that we've focused on in our lab is a big membrane focus.
Mm,
So, not this take a supplement and then it's going to do something in 24 hours. It is very much that long term intake where you have to remodel those membranes to start including that DHA in there and potentially pushing some of this other stuff out, like arachidonic acid. So, we sought out to really drive forward with a membrane hypothesis to really drive home the fact that these DHA molecules have to make it into the membrane for it to actually exert effect. So we used physically trained adults. We supplemented them with a reasonably low dose. So when you look at a lot of research papers, you see these massive numbers where it's 2,000 plus milligrams,
mm,
which is fine. But we went for a longer duration. So we went 12 weeks in the intervention study, and gave them a dose of about 700 milligrams of DHA.
mhm.
We call it a food first approach. And the reason we say that is if you look at the dietary guidelines, we have roughly 2 to 3 fatty fish meals as recommended.
Yeah,
And actually, I'll take that back. The dietary guidelines are a bit behind on that.
yeah,
Most fatty acid body guidelines, ISFAL, those sorts of things, they recommend that. The dietary guidelines are still quite low. But that 2 to 3 fatty fish meals per week gives you somewhere between 600 to 800 milligrams of DHA if you're
yeah,
taking that over time.
yeah,
So we went with a reasonably low dose, protracted period of time, tracked the biomarker over the 12 weeks to ensure that these participants consumed what we asked them to consume and the control group didn't consume anything.
yeah. And in your study, you used a micro encapsulated DHA tablet rather than using traditional fish oil. Most people are familiar with big fish oil, capsules. You know, I know what microencapsulation is, but from your view, what is microencapsulation and why did you use it?
Yeah, I was reasonably new to the technology, and found it fascinating with how this little oil droplet is encapsulated in either a carbohydrate bubble or something like
Yeah.
that. And the reason we wanted to use it was there's actually quite a few people, athletes, general population that can't swallow capsules or they struggle quite a bit to swallow those capsules. So what the microencapsulation allowed us to do was actually put it into a chewable tablet. And I know at first that sounds horrendous to chew fish oil, but we had the sensory qualities of it were actually quite good. We had some participants coming back saying, "Can I buy some more of these?" They really loved it. So by putting that into a powder and then compressing that into a tablet, the delivery format was quite novel, and for us, it was quite big.
Did you find that compliance was better?
I did actually, yeah.
Yeah.
It had quite a nice orange taste,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like eliminating barriers to do something. If you've got a fish oil capsule or a standard omega-3 capsule, there's another barrier that you have to go find water to consume it with. And I know that sounds small, but if you're, I don't know, you're in your bedroom at night and you've forgotten to take your fish oil, you've got to go get a glass of water to take that.
Yeah.
Chewable tablet, you just pop a tablet, chew it, you're done.
So you also had participants stop taking their tablets 48 hours before the final blood test, the omega-3 test. Why was that important?
Couple of reasons behind that. The main one being is our lab's push on a membrane hypothesis. So we go back from when Prof. Peter McLennan was doing research, I want to say maybe 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's always been this idea that you have to remodel the membrane for something to happen.
Yeah.
It's not like you take an ibuprofen and something happens. So that 48-hour washout was really to say, we've given it to them for 12 weeks. It's in their system. It's in the membranes. We want to wash them out. So all the circulating levels of EPA or DHA are completely gone from the system. There's no acute dose that's going to influence anything. And if we see a change, it's going to be because there's a membrane effect. So for us, that was quite important.
So you just basically wanted to check to see how much in the blood or in the tissue?
Yeah, well, that was the other thing is we did want to get a very accurate reading of what the omega-3 index was. Now, we used whole blood. So you basically finger prick yourself, you dab that onto a card, and then that gets estimated. So it's whole blood going to red blood cell.
Fair enough.
You do have some plasma in that, so you have to acknowledge it. And if you have a very large dose of EPA or DHA right before a finger prick blood test, you will have circulating levels in the plasma.
Yeah.
So we want it to be as transparent and honest as possible with this is actually what their values are.
So after 12 weeks of DHA supplementation in one of your studies, what happened to the omega-3 index?
Yeah. So we saw quite a large rise in that omega-3 index over the 12 weeks, only in the intervention groups, and no difference between control.
Yeah.
So importantly, by that 12th week, if you compared every participant in the DHA group to every participant in the control group, you can almost think of them as completely separate.
Yeah.
So there was absolutely no overlap, and we had completely separated the groups so that we could, any outcomes that we were looking at, they're completely different.
Yeah, yeah. And then what was really interesting, detailing your data, the omega-3 index kept on rising to about 8 weeks.
Yep.
And then it plateaued.
Yep.
What does that tell us about the body and then how it handles DHA?
Yeah, so there's different rates that you can increase the red blood cell marker or omega-3 index by modifying that dose or duration. So it's a function of both. We had an increase up to 8 weeks, and then it stayed steady at week 12. So basically we went week 0, increased to week 4, increased to week 8, and then it stayed flat. So what that told us was for the dose we used, 700 milligrams, we got to about 7.5% omega-3 index, which is quite good. It's almost 8.
Yeah.
But at that dose, we couldn't go any higher. Importantly for us, and testing our hypothesis of membranes, like I mentioned earlier, not every tissue incorporates at the same rate.
Yeah.
So even though let's say we hit peak at 8 weeks, muscle might still be lagging. And we've actually seen some of this with some of the previous data from Chris McGlory's lab, where red blood cells have a bit of a lag in response to that skeletal muscle phospholipid.
Yeah.
So giving that extra 4 weeks at peak sort of let all the other tissues catch up.
Yeah. So does that mean like longer supplementation? I'm just thinking about an athlete now that's listening. Does that mean longer supplementation or even more, a higher dose? Do you really need 2 grams a day to get the effect that you're talking about?
Yeah, no. So from our perspective, and like I said, this has gone back 40 plus years from Peter McLennan. In my PhD thesis, it's not published, but we actually collated some of the animal data that they've collected over the years. And it generates a really nice picture of what this dose response looks like. And that's specific to the gastroc muscle in an animal.
Yeah.
And you basically get this very steep increase when you go from 0, so no intake. You start introducing a little bit, which is about 600 milligrams of DHA. You get this big peak and then it sort of plateaus out. And where it starts to plateau is at about 1,000 milligrams. So from our perspective, it's this food first approach. You can do it through food. You can take a supplement. You can take, a very low amount, but it's really the time that matters. You need to be doing that long term, and
Yeah.
it's not a quick fix.
Yeah. And then for someone that's listening right now that's in, either an athlete or someone just want to be active, what might be thinking about the omega-3 supplement? What's a practical takeaway especially in terms of dose
Yep.
and duration that you found was best?
A supplement is exactly that. You can supplement your dietary intake with that. Most people don't eat fish habitually or at high enough levels.
Yeah.
So if you are a fish eater, you could maybe consider adding in one capsule just to cover your bases. If you consume no fish, like I'm actually not a fish eater, I really don't like fish. I am solely supplements. So for
Yeah.
me, it's at a supplement that provides about 500 milligrams DHA, maybe 100-ish milligrams of EPA, 2 capsules per day, you're more than covered. But the important thing is long term.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, I want to move to the notion or the theme of exercise and muscle damage, and especially in terms of what you've done. And, anyone that's actually done strenuous exercise, it's going to hurt,
Yep.
right? And it's in the muscle. So to that part, the people who will train will find really relatable in terms of, people who are doing either endurance sports or cycling or even just, for football. Your study was put through eccentric exercise, specifically cycling.
Yep.
Can you explain what eccentric exercise is and actually what causes so much that the muscle damage happens and which relates to a pain or hurt?
Yep.
What they actually achieve.
So the first part of that eccentric exercise is basically the lengthening of a muscle under load. So if you think of doing a bicep curl and the weight is still in your hand, it's coming down, the muscle's still actually contracting. It's just lengthening while it's contracting.
Mm.
We used a eccentric cycle ergometer. That's a fancy way of saying it's a really awkward looking bicycle that goes in the opposite direction. It's got a big motor that sits on the front of it, and it actually drives the pedals. So you resist those pedals as they're coming towards you. We used that model specifically to try and have something very novel because we had trained participants in our study. We didn't want them to already be familiar with bicep curls or squats or things like that. So we used something that like no one has access to an eccentric ergometer. It was custom made for us. It was built for our study. And it provided a novel stimulus to actually test soreness and these damage markers. Now, what actually causes that soreness in eccentric exercise, what we think, and what I was surprised to find out when I started this PhD, we don't actually have concrete reasoning as to why we get sore. We have theories. And one of the theories is the nerves actually get compressed between the muscle fibers. So it's very much a neural thing.
Yeah.
As the muscle's contracting, you get these small tears, micro damage, if you want to call it that. We're not as convinced that that's a big influence, but what it does do is it increases the inflammatory response to say tissue's damaged, things have happened at the site. Let's get some inflammation happening to try and to mop this up.
Yeah.
And what that inflammation or inflammatory response actually does is it sensitizes those nerve endings. So it basically makes them more annoyed. And that's the pain response that gets sent back to the brain.
Yeah.
You've basically ticked off the nerves around the muscles.
Yeah. So let me frame this next question. I get up in the morning, I go for a long run and come back, I'm okay. And then next day, I'm sore.
Yep.
Right? We call this the delayed onset of muscle soreness, right?
Yep.
What is actually happening, from a biological perspective?
Yep. What we think is happening and why it's delayed is in large part because of those processes around inflammation and sensitizing those nerve endings, it takes time. So if it was purely a muscle damage thing and the soreness is directly related to damage, we should see that pretty early on because we see biomarkers of damage like creatine kinase increase basically immediately. The delayed aspect of it is those nerve endings take time to send signals back. The sensitization of those nerve endings take time. which is why there's a bit of a delay in that.
Yeah. So you measured a wide range of outcomes after the exercise session in your study, including soreness, jump height, force, output, inflammation markers. Why cast such a wide net? Sort of different aspects to your study. I'm sure there is, but would like to know why.
Yeah, it was planned.
Yeah.
We actually tried to create a story with all of those measures. If we think that the soreness is being influenced by the inflammation, we need to measure both.
Yeah.
If we think that function is reduced because you're now more sore and you have less proprioception, we need to measure that. So it's kind of this cascade to say we think inflammation's influencing soreness and we think soreness is influencing function.
Mm.
So let's measure it and see if there's any coherency between
Yeah.
these measures.
Yeah. Yeah, we talk about recovery, right? I'm going to move to recovery in a moment and why it's so important, right? So a lot of coaches and sports scientists are now focusing on recovery. That's so important because that actually impacts, the performance itself. And I want to sort of talk about, or get you to talk about the did DHA make a difference in your study, right? So the headline from your study after 12 weeks of DHA supplementation, did it make a meaningful difference to how people felt in terms of their recovery?
Yes, it did. That's the takeaway. Um, the biggest effect that we saw was in those soreness parameters. We had quite a big reduction in delayed onset muscle soreness at 24 and 48 hours
Mm.
post exercise. Um, in terms of physical function, we think that is a flow on effect from the reduction in soreness. Where we saw the biggest benefit was actually in jump height.
Mm.
And this is the stuff that doesn't come through in research papers.
Yeah.
But being in the lab with people, it was blinded, but you could tell the people that said that they weren't as sore as they were at week 0, they were just less hesitant in that dip phase of the jump. So counter movement jump is you basically have to drop down to the bottom as quick as you can and explode up. When your legs aren't working how they should work, or you're really, really sore, there's going to be a hesitancy to do that because you wonder if you're going to get back up. And we had a handful of participants that really got impacted by this eccentric cycling. And they were so nervous to go down because they didn't think they'd come back up. That's how severe this was.
Yeah.
So we think a lot of that functional benefit, especially in the counter movement jump, was due to a reduction in soreness,
Yeah.
as opposed to anything happening, at a muscle fiber level. And then the last thing, which was inflammation, this is probably the most exciting part, is we saw no difference. And I say it's the most exciting part because we then mapped that onto an area under the curve. So rather than looking at soreness at 24, 48, immediately post, or any time point, we saw none of that. There was no individual time point differences. But when you look at the overall response, including their pre-exercise response, it was lower at week 12 than it was at week 0. So what that was sort of hinting to us is there's probably something here with the overall inflammatory response rather than any individual time point.
Yeah.
And we can probably get to that in a bit, but we have some theories as to why that might be.
Yeah. But the outcome of the study, it showed 56% lowering of muscle soreness from the DHA. Can you help us understand how that came about? I mean, generally for me, I always thought it was EPA that helped with anti-inflammation, but something else must be happening here.
Yeah. And what we think that is, this is a great setup for me. Thank you. On the last question with the inflammatory response is we think it's around resolvins,
Okay.
which are molecules that are downstream of DHA and EPA to an extent. The DHA resolvins are really potent, and we've seen some animal stuff where they can really reduce that pain effect. Because we gave a DHA dominant oil, we think it's those resolvins that were doing quite a bit of the work in terms of that reduction in soreness.
Yeah. Good. And just in terms of what about the physical performance? We talked about the jumping height and the isometric force. Were there differences there too? Between the two groups?
There wasn't a difference between groups because we recruited in a 2-to-1 fashion. So we had twice as many intervention group as we did control group. In hindsight, there was some issues with that. The biggest one being when you have a lower sample size in either of the groups, it's harder to show statistical difference.
Yeah, yeah.
It was quite clear if you look at the graphs visually that there's a difference, especially jump height. But because of our difference in numbers between the groups, we showed a within group change. So within the DHA group, we saw improvements, but that wasn't always the case for the function measures between groups at week 12.
Oh, excellent. There's a really important point in your research where you suggest DHA may be promoting the resolution of inflammation rather than simply suppressing it. That sounds quite a different to how something like ibuprofen would work. Can you explain that distinction?
Yep. So, like I was getting at earlier, the classical headspace has always been anti-inflammatory. So, reduce that inflammatory response. We actually know the inflammatory response is incredibly useful. It helps us build muscle, it helps us adapt, it helps us recover from things. More recently, and I say recently in research, but this is actually quite a long time in terms of non-research, but over the last 20 years, we've discovered this resolution physiology. When I say we, there's a guy named Charles Sirhan he's in Boston. He really has pioneered a lot of this stuff where it's not just that we have an inflammatory event and then when that event is no longer there, inflammation somehow comes back down to baseline.
Mm.
He's proposed, and we've actually seen many studies since then, that this recovery of inflammation or resolution is an active process. And the active metabolites that are really working there are called specialized pro-resolving mediators or SPMs.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very new and really hard to measure in humans because they have tiny molecules that are downstream of EPA and DHA.
Mm-hmm.
These molecules basically come in at the point of inflammation. So as we get that big spike in inflammation, not long after that, these resolvins are coming in and working alongside the pro-inflammatory mediators to try and modulate that response. If we can get that peak inflammatory event back down to baseline sooner, that's really what we want.
Yeah.
We don't want to blunt that ceiling. Like if we give an ibuprofen, we block the pathway to inflammation and we could potentially get maladaptation.
Yeah.
If we're still getting the peak, which is basically what we saw in our study, but that overall curve has come down, what we're saying is as the peak comes up, comes back down, those valleys are coming back lower each time. Whereas if we don't have enough resolution to that inflammation, those valleys stay higher at each point of successive inflammation. And that's where you get that chronic inflammatory event.
So where does the SPM play a role in this? I mean, you talk about the study in Boston. Where does that play in this whole sort of recovery space?
So going right back to the beginning, DHA gets inserted into the phospholipid membrane.
Mm.
From there, it kind of has a few functions. One, it helps orchestrate what's happening at the cell level, but it also can act as a substrate. So it sits there as a bit of a bank.
Mm.
That substrate, when there's an event or something has happened, it can get sent out of the cell. So basically it gets released from the cell and then gets metabolized into these downstream resolvins.
Mm.
So if we've got more DHA in that phospholipid membrane, when something happens like muscle damage and there's a lot of DHA around, it can get sent out, metabolized down to these tiny little resolvins, brought in to help basically get that inflammation back down, and away you go.
So these DHA really is the precursor of SPMs, these SPMs you talk about?
Yeah. You do get E-series SPMs, which are EPA derived, and D-series, which are DHA derived.
Okay.
Where we've seen a lot of potency in terms of, they call it anti-nociception or anti-pain, seems to be around those D-series resolvins.
Oh, excellent. So just in your study, you stopped the participants from taking the tablets 48 hours before the final assessment, but you still saw a recovery benefits.
Yep.
Can you explain that?
Yep. That was very much by design. Going right back to the study design issues where people will jump into the field and want to have a go and good on them, but they don't understand the membrane hypothesis. They will jump in, give an omega-3 supplement for a few weeks and say, we're going to test something, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work.
Mm.
This is the idea that it's like an ibuprofen where you give it acutely and it does something. We wanted to completely eliminate that. We washed them out for 48 hours. So there was nothing in circulation. There was no acute, here's a supplement, let's see what happens. We were relying entirely that DHA was in the membrane and it was doing its function.
And then you only followed recovery for 48 hours post-exercise.
Yep.
What would you want to measure if you had another shot at this study?
Yeah. There's quite a few things I'll do different.
We always want that.
Exactly. The biggest limit of this was financial.
Yeah.
We measured a lot of things. We had a lot of equipment in the labs, and trying to extend that out beyond 48 just wasn't practical.
Yeah.
The ideal would be to track them all the way back to complete resolution.
Yeah.
So by 48 hours, they were still sore, both groups. So it didn't completely abolish the soreness
Yeah.
effect.
Yeah.
But what would be nice is to track both groups back down to complete zero. That might be a week. It might be 96 hours. We don't really know. That would be nice. The other thing that would be a great addition would be to now start measuring where we think the mechanism is actually working with these resolvins, to start measuring that in human blood.
Excellent. So we'll just finish up. I was going to ask you one last question. If there's a listener out there who's an athlete or a practitioner that wants to utilize omega-3 or DHA in their sort of training protocol, how would you suggest they do it?
I would look for a high quality supplement that
Yeah.
has generally DHA dominant, if you
Yeah.
can find one.
Yeah.
1 to 2 capsules per day, long term, and you're not going to notice anything in terms of immediate effects.
Yeah.
Give it time, take it for a protracted period, and you're good.
Excellent. Ryan, this has been a fantastic conversation. What stands out is the practical message. A modest, consistent dose of DHA, about the same as a couple of serves of oily fish each week, can meaningfully reduce muscle soreness and help trained athletes maintain performance. And by measuring the omega-3 index, your research shows that the supplement was actually changing omega-3 status, which puts this work on a much stronger footing than many earlier studies. We'll link to both of the papers in the show notes. Ryan, thank you for joining us on The Good Oil.
DHA, the athlete's choice. Heart and brain, let's raise our voice. Muscle recovery will go far. With Omega-3, your shining star.